Congratulations to those graduating. This is an important day, and hopefully it will be the start of many, many more graduations as you maintain a lifelong learning attitude. Our agenda today really is to look at the importance of context, to understand some of the future fit skill sets that you will need to be relevant in tomorrow's world, and then lastly, to understand why all this matters. I'm from South Africa. I'm based in London. If I have a silly grin on my face, by the way, it's because I'm a big Liverpool fan, so you'll excuse me, okay? I'm expecting it to last for about a year. But I'm based in London. I'm South African, and in South Africa, anyone speaks Zulu? Does anyone fluent in Zulu? I thought I'd be on safe ground. Okay, so I'll look like a linguistic expert, which I'm anything but. There's a wonderful Zulu word. Zulu is one of those languages that's a little bit lazy. It takes one word and has a whole paragraph of meaning associated with the one word. And the word I want to teach you is umpuyazi. Do you want to give that a go? Umpuyazi. You got to say umpuyazi. You'll do. That's pretty good. What umpuyazi means is simply this: to come away from a situation, from a conversation, from a relationship, from a process, to come away knowing more. And I'm sure you come away from this process that you've been involved in knowing a whole lot more. Hopefully from the hour I have with you, you'll come away knowing more. But the best definition of wisdom that I've ever come across is that it's knowledge applied. It's no good just knowing stuff. It has to be applied. We all know people that know a lot of stuff. It doesn't make them wise. Wisdom is knowledge applied. And so to come away knowing more is only half the equation. And I hopefully will leave you with knowing more, but also hopefully inspire you or give you some practical tools that you can start implementing that gives you the gift of wisdom. So that's the aim of our time together. As has been mentioned, I'm a futurist, and that has I could keep you here all day with the stories attached to that. Up until very recently, on entering Heathrow, you needed to fill out a landing form, and obviously under occupation, I put futurist. And I remember one such gentleman, I gave him the form. You know, you get two types of immigration officials. One that wants to be your best friend, and you feel like you're never going to get into the country because you're having all this wonderful conversation. And the other one that gives you the impending sense that you're about to be arrested and deported before you even get past his or her desk. And I had one of those gentlemen. Not a word had passed between us, and I'm standing there, and he says, futurist, eh? I said, yes, sir. He says, can you tell me who's going to win the premiership? I wanted to assure him it definitely wouldn't be Arsenal, but you've got to be very careful about your use of humor in these uneven power situations. But I had another one the other day who looks up at me and says, so what's your favorite flower? And I think, gee, that's an odd question. I know nothing about flowers, but, you know, they determine where the conversation goes. So I answer, and next moment we're in this detailed conversation about flowers and flower arranging, and I'm wondering to myself, where is this going? And then I realize he's misread futurist for florist. He thinks I'm a florist. So lots of stories. What does a futurist do? All a futurist does is it's somebody who intentionally builds the capacity to see and understand the implications and meaning of change. Say it again. To intentionally build the capacity to see and understand the implications and meaning of change. And when I work with executives, I say to them, as a senior leader in any organization, given that definition, you should call yourself a futurist, because that is the work and responsibility of leaders. And I'd want to suggest you need to make that your work, to continually be looking at seeing and understanding the implications and meaning of change. So you have to pay attention to context. You can't have a discussion around strategy or leadership or the future without understanding context. And context is one of those things that kind of goes in and out of focus. There are times we think we can see clearly, and there are other times where we're really struggling to see the hand in front of our face. We also need to understand about context is that our reality, our sense of normal, is not everybody's sense of normal. When I work in Asia, in China, or Vietnam, or India, I don't bother showing this picture or video because this is their sense of normal. They understand this. When I'm in Europe or North America, I show it because we often assume that our sense of normality is the world's sense of normality. And if we haven't traveled much, we've got to remind ourselves that the majority of the world has a normal that is not like our sense of normality. And so this is important to understand. Normally, you need shock therapy in the UK with their fixation on health and safety standards by now. But our normal isn't everybody else's normal. So I want to give you a quick framework to understand context. This comes out of the East-West Center in Hawaii. We were involved with them in a 3-year research project back in the early 2000s to look at the impact of globalization. 4 features, 4 quick handles on globalization. 1, we are living in a world that is increasingly interdependent. What this means is if Asia sneezes, Africa catches a cold. This is why Brexit is so traumatic and problematic for all parties concerned, because it's trying to undo decades' worth of creating greater and greater interdependence. I work a lot with Boeing, and that's an interesting place to be right now. But I was having dinner with the person who heads up the manufacture and putting together of the Dreamliner, the 787. And he was telling me that the manufacture of the Dreamliner 787 aircraft is a great example in interdependence. The wings are made in Nagoya, Japan. The wingtips come from South Korea. The horizontal stabilizers are made in Italy. The cargo and cabin doors are manufactured in Sweden. The undercarriage comes from the UK. And parts of the technology that go into the nose cone are manufactured in Russia. So there in the manufacture of one aircraft, one product, if you like, is that level of interdependence. And that is a norm across many industries and sectors, a world that is increasingly interdependent. Secondly, a world that is increasingly experiencing accelerated or exponential non-linear change. An easy way to demonstrate this would be to look at this picture taken in New York City in 1900. And if you look very carefully, you can see one vehicle. But the majority of the transport is dominated by horse and carriages. You fast forward to 1911, and now we have footage of a real mishmash between horse and carriage and automobile. And the car noises can be heard, and the horse hoof noises can be heard. A real cacophony and confusion of different levels of transportation. 3 years after this, in 1914, if you look at a street in New York, now you struggle to see the horse and carriage. In 14 short years, think about the impact on life, on the city, in the transformation from horse and carriages to automobiles. In fact, in the late 19th century, there was a survey done around what would be the impact of globalization using New York City in particular. And the consultants that did it, they weren't called consultants back then, but who looked at it, said that we never needed to worry about cities growing beyond a certain size. And the reason they gave is that horse manure would be a prohibiting factor in too many people living in too close a proximity to each other. Horse manure. And so again, when the things change, and they change alarmingly quickly, suddenly the scenarios change dramatically. We are living through times of accelerating nonlinear change. You might say to me, Keith, but if you went to my grandparents and said to them, when you were young, did it seem like the world was changing exponentially? Because I'm sure they would say yes. And you'd be right. Every generation looks at the change that they are experiencing as exponential. But we know when we look through the sweep of history that there are pockets of true exponential change. And of course, history will have to judge this era, but I have no doubt that when historians look back on this particular era in which you are living and in which you will lead, it will be marked as a time of exponential change. We've already heard about the fourth industrial revolution. The third characteristic of globalization is a world of increasing complexity. And it's important to distinguish between complexity and complicated. Up to now, we've had a complicated world. And in a complicated world, business efficiency matters. Understanding how to work harder and faster and smarter is a way of getting through the complicatedness of life. But in a world of complexity, the rules that govern complicated are suspended. They simply do not work. We cannot meet complexity with greater degrees of efficiency. And you need to remember this in your IT solutions, much of which is designed and producing greater clarity in a world that is complicated. But we are living increasingly in a world that is complex. If you want to dig deeper into this, go and read a wonderful book by General Stanley McChrystal on Team of Teams, as he encountered this in leading the Special Task Force in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. So let me give an example of complicated. The Rubik's Cube, invented in 1972, is complicated. How many here can do the Rubik's Cube? I'm in a room of smart people. The stat is that less than 6% of the global population can do it. And there were quite a few hands that went up here. So you can do that. That's complicated. Maybe you would struggle a little bit with that Rubik's Cube, which is complicated on steroids. But if you want complicated on real steroids, here's a 12-year-old Chinese kid who a year ago solved 3 Rubik's Cubes while juggling them simultaneously. It was in the Guinness Book of Records, and the time it took to do this, 5 minutes and 6 seconds. Now, that is complicated, but it is complicated on steroids. The fourth characteristic that took all the researchers by surprise was this one. Because you'd expect in a world that is more and more connected and the same and closer, that sameness would dominate, and exactly the opposite was revealed through the research. In fact, the researchers initially wanted to dismiss this because it didn't fit in with what they thought would be an emergent picture, a world of increasing difference. This is what explains Brexit. This is what sits behind the mysterious Trump presidency. We understand that we are living in a world that, although there is sameness at some level in immigration, etc., there's this increasing swing to the right in politics around the world, in societies, an increase in nationalism and tribalism. And I don't know how far the pendulum is going to swing or when it will start to come back, as it invariably will, but we need to understand this as the prevailing context. And when you understand this point, it makes sense of some of the geopolitical movements that we are seeing sweeping across the planet. We are living in a world of change. I have the privilege to work with a lot of business schools and directly with clients at an executive level. And invariably, when I say to an exco team, do you feel in your team, your business, your sector, you are keeping pace with the change out there? Invariably, the answer is not. And there is a widespread sense of panic that we are not keeping pace with this inordinate change that is driving the context in which we are living and doing business. And so there's this emphasis, and everyone's telling us we need to be agile and nimble and quick. And later I want to give a bit of a framework around what that means. And so it's a drumbeat that is hard to ignore. We need to be agile and nimble and quick, and there's no getting away from that. So what if we look into the future then would be some of the skill sets that would stand us in good stead in order to be relevant in tomorrow's context. These are the 8 that we came up with in our research. You've already seen other research that's been done. Deloitte came up with 6, and the 6 that Deloitte measured were all embedded in the 8 that we came. So there'll be some variations on these, but pretty much most people who are looking at what are the things we need to embed today by way of practical skill sets that will serve us well in the future are saying the same thing. I was saying earlier in a conversation, we could have put nice business language to all of these and made them more impressive. We've deliberately kept them a bit provocative and soft and edgy because that engages more discussion. We could have found more sophisticated business terminology, but I've deliberately, as I said, kept it accordingly. So we're going to look at 4 of these very quickly. We don't have time to go through all 8, but I want to highlight 4. The first one, horizon scanning. We need to find ways to look out the window and do so intelligently. So if I ask you to close your eyes, always a dangerous exercise at this time of day, but close your eyes and point north. Close your eyes and point north, wherever you think north is. North. No consulting apps. All right, a lot of you aren't committing. Some have committed. If you open your eyes and look where we're pointing, I'm glad we're not going to the North Pole. We'd be in real trouble as a group. I don't know quite how you argue with that, because that's kind of like, that's actually quite clever. Here's what happens, is when we as companies, as organizations, collectively come to horizon scan to look out the window, we end up pointing in all different directions. I don't think it's important we know what the future is. No one can really tell us that. But I do think what's important when we do it collectively is that we bring a level of coherency to where we're looking and the conversations we're having. And the model I want to share with you is one that helps us with that coherency. A lot of the work I do and what I do is unpacking this model over a day or even 2 days. I'm going to go through it in about 20 minutes. Todds is an acronym that says there are 5 key disruptors. And if you're paying attention to these 5 key disruptors and asking the right questions in each of the areas, you will pretty much be future-proof. So the 5 areas, the T, not surprisingly, stands for technology. And technology is a very broad area. You could look at sea snails that last year scientists in Britain were able to transfer memory from one sea snail to the next. And that transfer of memory is seen as the building block to one day being able to do it from one brain to the next. You could look at a drone that's already being employed in Amsterdam. When there's a medical emergency on the street, they fly the drone in. That's a real-time clock you're seeing while the emergency services are getting there. And the drone is armed with defibrillators. It's connected to medical practitioners who talk the people on the spot through what they need to do to save a life. Or you look at implants. 3,000 people in Sweden agreed to have an implant put into them that can monitor various things, give them access. So rudimentary understanding and first step towards technology that becomes embedded. Technology used to be out there, then it became wearable technology. This ring I've got is a curve ring. It means it's a payment ring. So when I go to a checkpoint, instead of pulling out a credit card, I can just put my hand there. It's wearable technology. It works exactly the same as a credit card. And then the next level is implanted technology. You could look at a voice lab. I go to Russia, so I think, gee, it would be cool to speak Russian. The only Russian I know is Privyet Kaktala, which I believe and I hope means hello, how are you? But I think it would be useful to speak Russian. So I go to a lab and they put a chip in my brain that gives me instant access to the Russian language. The cognitive scientists are working out what part of the brain controls linguistics. We can learn how to augment the brain in the same way that we've augmented physically. Think about the impact of brain technology being augmented. In other words, being able to acquire knowledge that we haven't yet learned. Or you could look at genetics and the debate around CRISPR, the ability to go and alter genetics. Genetic mapping has very quickly moved to genetic editing. And where that will go, who knows? I remember when Chris Barnard did the first world heart transplant, there was a large part of the world community who were uncomfortable with the notion of transplanting a heart, given the symbolic significance of the heart. Today, no one is uncomfortable with that. That is not an ethical concern at all. And I think the same will happen with gene manipulation or gene editing. If we can go in and manipulate the genes to take off the table certain dreaded diseases, why would a mother, a couple, agree not to have that done if it's a life-saving procedure? And so we could go on. We could look at the robotic hotel in Japan. 80% of the hotel's functionality performed by robots. They've just opened up the second one in Tokyo with plans to open up another 8 more. It's on my bucket list. I'll be in Tokyo later this year, but I'm definitely not going to stay there because right now it gets lousy reviews on TripAdvisor. I'm waiting for them to go up. Or we could look at blockchain. I was in Singapore a few weeks ago looking with a group of insolvency lawyers and judges around the impact of blockchain on their profession, because blockchain is going to affect anything which involves a contract. And so we could go on and on. Technologies, some of which are already up and running, that will have dramatic impact on how we live and how we work. You could look at the amount of information. Every single day, the fastest processor in the world sits in China. It's Tahini 2. It can process 750 million trillion calculations per second. That's quick. The amount of bytes of data every day produced, 2.5 quintillion. That's 2.5 with 18 zeros behind it. So I said to some smart friends I've got, give me some analogies. No one can comprehend a number with 2.5 with 18 zeros. Give me something that we can hang our hats on. So one friend wrote back, I haven't fact-checked any of these, but I do trust the sources. One friend wrote back and said that is 4 times the amounts of grains of sand on planet Earth. Another said if you monetarize that, it would mean if you had $2.5 quintillion, you would be able to give every single person on planet Earth, rounded off to 7 billion people, you'd be able to give every single person $329 million US. I can see this is having no real impact on you. So let me put it in terminology that you understand, beer consumption. If you had 2.5 quintillion pints of beer, it would mean that it would take the entire Earth's population, including the Australians, 6 million years to drink. It's a big number. This is why the machines win at the end of the day. And we need to understand this and understand the technologies that are making roads into this. In leaving technology, let me just say this. Technology is not the beginning and end of everything.
Emma. Huh? Emma. 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 Emma.
The iron tide stands for institutional change. Our institutions are changing. It stands to reason that if the world out there is changing, how we organize and do work is going to change. And it's important to understand this because these are business models that have significantly disrupted the traditional business models in each of these sectors. And we take these businesses today, whether they're succeeding or struggling as Uber is, for granted. But we need to remember that not that long ago, these were inconceivable. No one thought that this was even possible, and yet they've landed, and they've landed in a way that has severely disrupted the traditional business models. And I think there are a lot of current business models and established sectors out there that are on their final legs in terms of relevance and being able to deliver. The D in TIDE stands for demographics. That's going to be something that is probably the most neglected in leadership conversations. Why? Well, because demographics takes a long time to unfold. For instance, economists have been warning Europe for decades that the biggest impending crisis that Europe is going to face is the impending retirement of baby boomers, because the math simply doesn't add up. And now that baby boomers are nearly peaking in retirement and the impact of them stepping out of the workforce is being felt, partly that's why there is the vacuum that was spoken about earlier that I heard in one of this morning. Because when you start to look at the people who are leaving the workforce and the drop in the fertility rate and the demographic of your generation, you start to realize why there is the problem. And so we don't pay attention to demographics because, well, that's a long term. The other day I was in Boeing. Boeing have a 30-year time horizon because of the industry that they're in. So when they talk strategy or talking tomorrow, it's a 30-year horizon. The very next week, I stepped straight into Deutsche Bank. How far do you think their time horizon was? Their time horizon was like this. It was the next quarter. And Deutsche Bank's time horizon is far more indicative of the average business speak and think around time horizons and demographics. So one of the demographics I wanted to highlight was the shift to the east. My mother grew up in a world where this part of the world was referred to as the Far East. And she was always fascinated by the fact that I go there so often, because in her world it was the Far East. There was something mystical, unobtainable about it. And I go there frequently. And she'd always say to me, when are you going back to the Far East? And every time she said Far East, I corrected her. I said, Mom, it's not the Far East, it's the Near East. It never landed. To her dying day, it was like a frisbee over a fat Labrador, to be honest. Far East, Near East, Far East, Near East, Far East, Near East. But the Far East has become the Near East. And we need to understand this. We are going to grow up in a world dominated by countries and economies that are very different to that of our own or very different from the past. Another quick demographic. If you look at a range of cities, I'm starting this clock from 1918. If you look at the cities that were the most populous cities in the world, and then you fast forward over the last 100 years to the current crop that are the biggest metropolitan areas, and big metropolitan areas are important for economies and societies and values and marketing and fashion. The only country that has survived that change is Tokyo. Every single other city that was on the top 10 city list 100 years ago has fallen off. And the whole characteristic of the top cities has changed. A demographic, a shift that if we're not wide awake and paying attention to, we miss. The E in TIDE stands for the environment. And as we look out the door and we look at a world that is getting increasingly warmer, in spite of what Donald Trump might think, we need to acknowledge that there are problems. In fact, the debate is not whether the world is getting hotter. The debate is what is causing it and what are the consequences. This scientific fact of the world is getting hotter, look at this NASA clip. This NASA clip looks at various countries. You can see the clock running again. I've started it just over the last 100 years of countries that are heating up. And scientists tell us if a country heats up between 0.5 and 1 degree, it can be catastrophic. And in almost every single case, that number is being exceeded. The debate isn't whether the world is getting hotter. Science tells us the world is getting hotter. The debate is what is causing it and what role do we have to play in the causation and what are the consequences. That's where opinion is divided. But we are living in a world where there are some very real issues happening. The S in TODD stands for shifting societal values. And values are important to pay attention to because values drive behavior. So when we encounter behavior that is unlike our behavior in people older or younger than us, a way to understand or decode that is to dig a bit deeper and say, well, what are the values that are driving that behavior? So Peter Drucker put it that way, and it makes sense and we understand it. But a far better way of expressing the same sentiment is what Douglas Adams did in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Douglas Adams put it this way. You young, for most of you in the room, starting out at the beginning of your career. And you might look at a statement like this and say, well, I can't really relate to this, but believe me, as the years tick by, you will start to relate to it. We have to be determined to be lifelong learners, to never fall into the trap or to avoid the trap as far as possible of getting beyond a certain age and then we become fixed in the way we see the world and understand the world and the way we behave in the world. And believe me, the older you get, the harder this becomes at every single level. So if you take these important words, when you think about your projects that you're involved in, the companies that you're engaged with, these are important words internally and externally. Internally to any company and externally with their clients or customers. And I want to suggest that based on different generations, every single one of these words will mean an entirely different thing depending on the age of the person that you're speaking to. How a person of my generation collaborates or interacts is fundamentally different to how a 24-year-old will do those same things. Same word, totally different meanings. And this is what we need to get our heads and hearts around in having better conversations about what do these things mean. Because depending on who you're speaking to, these things will mean completely different things. So there's the Todds Model. In probably less than 20 minutes, normally something that we spend a whole day on. But it's worth giving it to you because it's a framework to do the important skill set building of horizon scanning. There are lots of different frameworks you can use, but we need to be looking out the window and we need to be paying attention in a coherent way to what is changing and why. A tool that would help us do that is this tool of getting on the balcony. In other words, stepping back off the dance floor and getting on the balcony. Most executives that I work with are spending too much time on the dance floor. Why? Because that's what they're comfortable doing. That's what they're good at doing. That's what got them into the leadership positions that they are in. They were the best dancers, and that got noticed and promoted. And so they get into leadership, and rather than step back and get on the balcony from which you can see the entire sweep of the dance floor, they stay on the dance floor. Now, the problem with being on the dance floor in a world of change is that you can't see the change that is happening on the periphery of the dance floor. Your view is limited to your immediate surroundings. And when you're on the balcony, you can see the broad sweep of change. Now, I'm not saying a leader should always only be on the balcony. There are times when leaders do need to get on the dance floor, but the balance is all wrong. And the reason why a lot of companies are missing the future today at an executive strategic decision-making level is not because they're not smart people, not because they haven't been successful. They are smart and they have been successful. It's because they're not spending enough time on the dance floor having these kind of conversations. Adaptive intelligence is perhaps one of the key skills that you would need to learn. If you're a parent today, you will need to teach your kids how to be adaptive. Research shows that they're probably going to need to reinvent themselves merely from a career point of view 3 or 4 times during their working life. My generation, you went to college, you graduated, you then stayed in that trajectory. You qualified an engineer, you died an engineer. You qualified a lawyer, you died a lawyer. I was working with the Kairos Institute in Stockholm who researched generational theory in Europe, and they told me that by the age of 30, 72% of graduates are no longer working in the field in which they qualified. Graduates, that drives parents crazy. You need to know that because parents have invested in your qualification. You qualify, parents think my job is done, and then at 30 you're homeless and you're back living at home. That's not a good thing. But adaptability is what we need to understand. And if I was a parent of a young child today, I would be working very hard at understanding how I equip him or her to be adaptive in their approach to life. So I worked very hard at this. Everyone is saying, as I said earlier, you need to be agile and quick and adaptive, and no one's telling us what that means. Everyone's saying it, but what does it mean? And if you go to the leadership bookshelves, there are a couple of practical how-to things, but they tend to be very superficial. So I started to dig into what does it mean to be adaptively intelligent. And I came across a white paper written by two marine biologists by the name of Gunderson and Holling. And to be honest, I would have dismissed the paper as irrelevant to my research, but I started reading it out of my own interest in scuba and marine life, etc. And I discovered what that word serendipity is so beautifully descriptive of. I discovered hidden treasure in an unexpected place. Because embedded in their white paper that was looking at the adaptability of coral reefs in the Pacific, nothing to do with business, was the DNA of what is adaptive intelligence. Let me share that framework with you quickly. The ability, number one, to live with change and uncertainty. The ability to live with change and uncertainty. Understanding that turbulence is the new norm. So if you went to a futurist, and the way futurists talk about how the future unfolds, we use three words: continuation, cycles, and novelty. Continuations, more of the same. Tomorrow will resemble today, so if I understand and analyze today, I will be prepared for tomorrow. Cycles, what goes around comes around, and then novelty is the curveball, the thing that very few people predict or foresee. 9/11 would be a good, tragic, but a good example of novelty. Now, if you put a room full of futurists in a room before the economic collapse of 2008 and said, how is the future going to unfold? With the best algorithms and models that futurists could come up with, that would have been the ratio. If you put that same group of futurists in a room today, 10, 11 years later from then, and said, how's the future going to unfold? That's what they would be suggesting. We are living in a world of uncertainty and change, and it's the new norm. And so we've got to build organizations, and we've got to build personal capacity that acknowledges that learns how to be comfortable with that, and accepts that. Secondly, in terms of building adaptive intelligence, we need to embrace different types of knowledge for learning. We need to understand we need to disrupt the learning process. We need to get far more creative and be willing to live with discomfort in creating a learning process. The business schools that I'm involved with, and they're some of the blue chip business schools around the world, are far too conservative when they get clients because they don't want to upset the clients, because the evaluations are all based on happy sheets. How did you like today? And if you don't get a certain score, you don't get invited back as an external facilitator. And the metrics produce a sense of how do we keep our people comfortable and happy? I was once chatting to the former chairman of Unilever South Africa. He's retired now, but I said to him, Peter, in the role as chairman, when you were chairman, what was your best learning experience? And he said, gosh, that's an interesting question. Most people don't assume that a chairperson would still be learning. You know, learning is something you do until you get to that kind of role. So he said, I like your question, number one. But he said, number two, it's an easy answer for me. He said, a couple of years ago, I had a memo from head office in London that was informing me of a global chairperson's conference that Unilever were calling. And all it gave me was a date, a time, and a street intersection in Manhattan. So he said, clearly I realized there had been miscommunication. I needed agendas. There were reports I needed to prepare. So he said, I went to one of my PAs. He had two PAs, and he said, I'm at the office for a few days. When I get back, please will you have all this stuff together for me? She says, no problem. He says, I get back to the office and say, and? She says, sorry, sir, that's it. Date, time, street intersection in Manhattan. So he gets on the phone to London. He says, this is nonsense. And he says, the more I bang my fist on the table demanding agendas and reports, etc., the more I get stonewalled. Sorry. And he said, I got angrier and angrier. But he said, to be honest, looking back, my anger was masking a growing level of anxiety because I like to be in control. He said, I was so nervous that come the appointed time, I flew into New York ahead of time, checked into a nearby hotel. So he said, when it came time to meet, at least I had showered, I had changed. He said, I had colleagues who were getting out of taxi cabs from JFK, who had flown in from around the world, standing with their Gucci luggage in the middle of Manhattan. These were chair people of Unilever International. You can imagine. He said we even had to carry our own luggage. I wanted to stop him at that point and say, boy, have you lost touch with reality? But these are people who get picked up in 5-star limousines from airports, driven to 5-star hotels where there's no surprises in a 3-day conference, no surprise. And he said the level of anxiety was huge. He said at one time we had to roll up our trouser legs. We were mainly a group of men because we were walking through muddy area, carrying our own luggage. You can imagine. He said we didn't want to fire somebody. We wanted to know who was responsible so we could kill them. You know what it was? It was a 3-day conference on living with change and uncertainty. And the organizers said we can either disrupt them or we can put them in a 5-star hotel and talk about it for 3 days. Let's disrupt them and see how they handle it. That is why you sometimes need external consultants in your business, because it was an external voice that brought that, because no one would have had the courage in Unilever to suggest they disrupt their chair people like that, believe me. But he said, you know, when the method behind the madness became apparent, we were deeply embarrassed and ashamed, because we looked at our own response and we said to ourselves as chair people, if this was our response, how could we expect our executive teams around the world to respond in a different manner? And he said in an instant we realized we had a business, a global international business that wasn't ready to deal with change and uncertainty. And we needed to disrupt the learning process to make that possible. The third element of adaptive intelligence, we need to nurture diversity. Diversity and inclusion. I'm big on this. I could spend days on this because this has got to a level within our businesses of political maturity that has become completely ineffective because of political correctness. And I think we're going to need to go back and rethink this completely, and how we rethink it and what we do is going to be massive. Let me try and give you an example. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And why this work is so difficult and why the business schools and the educators don't want to engage in it, because it's messy and it's a process, because it starts with me. It starts with identifying my own prejudices, my own biases. It's fine to talk about frameworks and have clever theory around this, but doing this work in order to authentically engage with diversity means we've got to start with understanding our own biases and lenses. So about a year ago, I'm invited to speak at a large conference in Rome. It's the Women's International Network, 750 women from around the world. I get up with the mayoress of Rome, the first woman mayor of Rome, having just opened the conference, and I walk to the podium and I say, hi, my name is Keith, and I'm racist. And then I pause, and there wasn't what they were expecting. You could have heard the air just got sucked out of the auditorium. This look of horror, oh my gosh, what have we done inviting this lunatic? And I held the pause, and then I said, I'm a white South African. I grew up under apartheid. And if you understand the basics of how your environment shapes how you see the world, it would be ridiculous or naive of me to think that my environment hasn't shaped how I see the world. Every South African of my generation, black or white, sees color because we were trained from a young age to see color. I then said, however, and this was a very narrow and risky line to draw, I never want to act like a racist. And at some level, and mitigation of that, I'd like to submit this evidence that we as a couple, my wife and I, were the very first couple in South Africa to legally adopt cross-culturally. We were the test case going through the courts. They were making up the legislation to make that possible for us to do it. And the young abandoned baby that we adopted at 3 weeks in 1991 is a strapping young man living in Spain now of 27. So at least at some level, you see, when you talk color, you're talking family to me. I then said something that they were probably a little bit more prepared for, but it still shocked them. I said, I've got another confession to make. They held their breath, and I said, I also need to tell you that I'm sexist. Now, if you want to win friends and influence people in an audience of 750 women leaders, believe me, that's the smartest thing I could have said. I should have started that. But I said, I am, because I've grown up in a world that has always favored the men, and I can prove that, I can show that. And so again, to assume that I'm not sexist and that's not a blind spot would be naive. And so how do we have, this is what makes doing this work so difficult, because it starts with acknowledging the biases that we would rather not. And so we all have these lenses, and it's starting to say, how do these lenses play out and play a role in how I interpret right from wrong and good from bad? And how do I deal with a world that is full of paradox? We need to move in this area from understanding that we are different from each other. The problem, as I said earlier, with political correctness is we can't even have this conversation. We are different. There's no shame in being different. But we don't want to get stuck there. And we don't want to emphasize why we are different from each other. But we need to acknowledge it if we're going to move to learn how to be different for each other, to now leverage our differences, our different way of thinking and seeing and speaking and acting and behaving. And then ultimately, if we're working together, we want to learn what it means to be different together. That's the journey. And the problem is that our fixation with political correctness, and that means that we can't even acknowledge that we're different from. And so you are going to be required to lead these conversations in business in the future. And it's not going to be easy. The fourth element of adaptive intelligence, creating opportunity for self-organization. I'm not going to go into this, but why is this important? Because this is the element that creates sustainability. You want a sustainable team, a sustainable business. It's built on this foundation. And there's lots more we could say there. So they're the four elements. You want to be adaptive. You want to have an adaptive child. What do these four areas mean in your parenting? What do these four areas mean in your leadership? There's the blueprint, the framework to develop adaptive intelligence. Let's have a quick look at curiosity and storytelling. Alvin Toffler was a futurist who said this: the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so we need to understand that this thing about learning is not a once-off. It's a lifelong pursuit in a world of change, that if we're going to be adaptive, it means we need to be a learner. Fundamentally built into adaptability is this whole notion of learning. If you go and look at Ron Harflich's model on adaptive leadership, learning is a fundamental part of what it means to be an adaptive leader. Most leaders that I work with are not learner leaders. They have done with learning. They have done it, and that's the tragedy. So last year, as an example, I taught myself to write with my left hand. I'm naturally right-handed. Just not going to change the world, but it was an exercise in learning something new. We need to be learning something new. What are you going to be learning? My current exercise around unlearning is I've had reverse engineered a bicycle. When you turn the handlebars to the right, the wheel goes to the left. And besides trying to stay alive on this thing, I'm going to see if I can unlearn what it means to ride a bicycle. I got the idea from this gentleman, so let him explain it.
Just keep your feet on the pedals. Handles on them. Yep, come on. All right, one more time.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. So here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it.
It's very hard, believe me. So then he decides, can he learn how to ride a normal bicycle? Well, I'm in this phase now. I've had to suspend riding my normal bike. I love mountain biking, but I can't ride a normal bike while I'm trying to unlearn how to ride a bike. So he then goes to Amsterdam, the city of bicycles, to see if he can ride a normal bike.
It's backwards.
This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias.
So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American that can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right.
After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment.
I got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold it, it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike.
And the implication is this. I suspect there's going to be an awful lot of stuff that organizations that we're part of are going to need to unlearn. And we acknowledge it, we write it down, we say, yes, of course, but the process is very difficult. Very, very difficult. And I think institutions have underestimated the amount and difficulty of unlearning that is going to be necessary in what they have built as an institution in order to be future fit. And that becomes the challenge. So how do you build curiosity? Well, I was in Barcelona some time ago. I switched on the TV in my hotel room, and I saw an interview with a chap by the name of Brian Grazer. Never heard of him. It turns out Brian Grazer is a Hollywood producer. He's in a lifelong professional partnership with Ron Howard, and together they've won several Oscars. And Grazer was talking about a lifetime spent being curious. He said, I arrived in Hollywood as a 19-year-old kid, and I was insatiably curious. I fell in love with the industry. I never left Hollywood, and I built what he calls curiosity conversations. And he's got better at hosting curiosity conversations. A curiosity conversation is when he identifies somebody from whom he would like to learn something specific. And he targets that person until he gets in front of them for 20 minutes to have the conversation around what he needs to unlearn. And he said, you know, when you're a 19-year-old kid, getting access is difficult because some of the people were very high up in not only Hollywood, but outside of Hollywood. And I had to go through several firewalls and be very patient and keep knocking until I got my opportunity to meet with them. He said, now access has become easier. But I thought, what a great technique. If you're with a group of leaders who are senior, who have stopped learning, what a great technique. And if you were a team that I suspected had stopped learning, I would hold you accountable to have one curiosity conversation every week or every month, and we would start to discuss it. Is it relevant to the business in the short term? No, but it's starting to build the right practice and muscle and mentality in order to be curious in ways that are important for our future of the business. So I thought, well, let me practice it myself and see how it works. And so I tracked down Twiggy Baker. Twiggy Baker is the world champion big wave surfing champion currently. He has just won the title for the third time. And Twiggy regularly gets up on 70, that's him riding a wave there, 70, 80-foot waves. And my conversation with Twiggy was around fear. I wanted to know how he managed his fear because I can't think of anything more terrifying than getting up on a wave of that enormity. And the conversation around how he recognized and channeled his fear to keep him alive in that situation. And would he recognize one day when maybe he paddled out or got on the lip of a wave and he was no longer in control of his fear? I've got a conversation lined up, we just haven't found diary dates for it, with the longest living recipient of a double lung heart transplant. And with her, my fascination is, how do you prepare yourself for that? How do you prepare yourself emotionally and spiritually and intellectually and even physically to receive somebody else's lungs and heart? Curiosity conversations. We need to be more curious because curiosity fuels our learning. Linked to another tool around being curious is about asking better questions. Again, don't be afraid of asking questions. My generation don't ask questions because my generation have been told as a leader, if you ask too many questions, it might give the impression you don't know your stuff and you don't want to be vulnerable. And so my generation often bluffs their way through with an expertise that, to be honest, they don't have, because they're afraid to ask or be seen to be asking too many questions. I keep a little book with me and I write and record questions. When I hear them in conversations or I see them on billboards or I read them in magazines, I collect great questions to be asking myself and others. The Lincoln Memorial some time ago was deteriorating at an alarming rate. And they said, why is it deteriorating? It was crumbling, the facade was corroding. And they discovered they were using very powerful detergent to keep it clean because obviously it's all white. And they said, but why are we needing to wash it so frequently that's causing this corrosion? They then discovered that they were needing to wash it so frequently because birds were targeting it, and it was birds that were soiling the Lincoln Memorial. And they said, what's going on with these birds? Are they political creatures, or why are they targeting the Lincoln Memorial? And they discovered that the birds were being attracted by a large insect population that they fed off. And they said, why are there so many insects around the memorial? And then they discovered it had to do with the lighting, the type of lighting and the duration of the lighting that attracted the insects, that attracted the birds that caused the problem. Here's the lesson from this. Had they only asked one why question, they would have changed the detergent they were using. But by asking 5 why questions and digging deeper and deeper and having the patience to do that, they got to the root cause that meant they were able to reduce it. And so they changed some of the lighting. They reduced the hours of the lighting by an hour on each side. That over time took care of the insect population, that diminished the bird population, which meant they didn't have to wash it so often. We need to stick with why questions more than we do. One why question is not sufficient. Let me close with personal intelligence and just look at that. Really, this is self-awareness. And this circles all the way back to needing this skill, because if you're going to deal with diversity and inclusion effectively, you cannot do so without developing personal intelligence or self-awareness. Self-awareness is the bedrock of emotional intelligence. And to be honest, it's been very poorly positioned in business. I meet many executives who are very cynical and roll their eyes when you have this. We've got to find ways to introduce it where the message gets heard and understood. Because again, you've got those in charge, those who are pulling the levers, who don't really believe in this message and so don't give much time to it. It's an old message, though. It goes right back to the 4th century with the Temple of Delphi in Greece, where know thyself was inscribed, that inspired philosophers and leaders throughout the time. The oracle at Delphi was somebody who was supposedly able to see the future, and people would come in the 4th century from all over the ancient world to have a time with the oracle of Delphi, and it started with know thyself. It is what is the bedrock of authenticity. There's a lot of talk today about being an authentic leader, leading out of who you are. Well, this is the foundation. This is where it starts, doing the work of self-awareness. And if you want to say, well, Keith, how do I do this? What is one thing I can do? I would want to point you in the direction of the Enneagram. In my opinion, by far the best framework to understand oneself and what drives behavior. It's not a psychometric tool. It's not a Myers-Briggs or a Thomas or a DISC. Those have their place. And the easiest way I can describe the relationship between the Enneagram, which is ancient wisdom, and those tools, is that they're like the tip of the iceberg. When you do one of those assessments, and you get your report back, you look at it and you say, gosh, this is like looking in a mirror. But they don't tell you, they're not designed to reveal why you are the way you are. They simply give you a reflection back and you say, gosh, that's accurate. The Enneagram takes you to the 2/3 part of the iceberg, the hidden part of the iceberg. Same iceberg, but at a far deeper level. And it's a fantastic tool to understand doing this work. So these are the 4 things, 4 tools, and there are many, many more, but these would be 4 practical things that are very simple at every level, that as you start doing them, you start building capacity and competency in being future fit. Now, again, this might be so obvious because most of you in this room are much younger. But believe me, as you get older and have more experience and have more answers, these are the things that drop off the radar very quickly. So find people who are older than yourself and latch onto them who are still practicing these. One of my mentors who I'm hoping to meet with in South Africa next week is about 82 now, but at 72 he went and started a PhD. And the moment I knew that he had done that, I said, here's a man I want to hook my wagon to, because somebody at 72 who goes and does a PhD and has that appetite for learning, I want to understand their motivation and their thinking. Let me wrap up. Why is all this important? Well, for one simple reason, it's going to be these things that allow you to challenge your orthodoxies and assumptions. And if you are going to be adaptive, you are going to need to continually challenge your orthodoxies and assumptions at an organizational level and at a personal level. The great failures in time of Kodak and Blockbuster and all these other stories that we hear about was often not because they didn't see the future coming. Certainly this is true in Kodak's story. It was because they weren't willing to challenge their business model. And in Kodak's case, the business model that they weren't willing to challenge was their film processing, and that was their cash cow of their business. The inability to challenge our business models and our orthodoxies and our assumptions creates an arthritic kind of condition at a personal level as well as at an organizational level. Mark Twain, one of my favorite characters, his real name was Samuel Clemens, and Mark Twain was a user of tremendous profanity. He swore like a trooper. His wife's name was Olivia, and she was very prim and proper, and she spent an entire lifetime trying to reform her husband of this behavior, which she detested. She tried everything and nothing worked. And one day, Olivia decided in desperation that what she was going to do is she was going to throw back at her husband, at Mark Twain, all the swear words that she could ever recall him using. And coming from her, it would shock him into some kind of reform behavior. And so she waited for the opportune moment. He walked into the room one day, swearing like a trooper, and she let rip. And apparently, Twain just stood there very still, very calm, and eventually she ran out of words. At which point he leaned forward and he said, "Olivia, my dear, you have the words, but not the tune. And I suspect you know the words, you have the words, but you need to make sure you hear the underlying tune." There's a bit.ly link. If you do want any of these quotes or the slides, please go ahead and download them. It's been a real privilege being with you. Enjoy the celebration of the graduation, and congratulations again. Thank you.